What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. On this installment on the 1UZ swap, we're actually going to pull the engine and transmission back out of the car so that we can do some little buttoning up things that we need to do to it. I just asked Terry if he wanted to start the car one more time before we pull the motor out. But we're going to pull the motor out, separate the transmission. We forgot to seal it when we changed out the bell housing to the adapter and everything, so I need to put some sealant on there and put it back together. And then we got to figure out what's going on with the shifter. We haven't gotten all the modifications that we need to do to it, all the kinks worked out of it yet. So I need to do a little bit more further diagnosis as to what the issue is with it and get that figured out. Once we get that figured out and weld the exhaust headers together with the extensions that we put on there, then we can drop the engine back in there and it never has to come back out again. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. And it looks like Terry is gonna start the car one last time before we take it out. So what's wrong? Oh, the battery's probably dead. You left the battery hooked up, didn't you? Yep, battery's dead. All right, I wanted to show you guys the intake that Terry's made. So this is a combination of a couple pieces, and this is not the final iteration. He's got a different filter coming for a Volkswagen 2.0 TSFI. The Carbino air intake, it's got an angled filter, and we're going to put that on here to get it away from the radiator. But this is a GS400 air intake that's been cut, and then just an aftermarket 3-inch diameter 40 or 90 degree elbow, and then two 3-inch adapters, and mass airflow sensor bolts right in. It sounds great when it's running, but we haven't been running the alternator on the car and the battery got left hooked up, so it's drained the battery, so we're gonna have to run a charger on that battery and get it charged back up. But we're gonna go ahead and pull the motor on this thing and get the transmission sealed up, install the one little bracket that has to be installed in here, run the power steering return line, because that's the only thing that's not done on the power steering system is running the return line. We get those done and then we can put the motor back in. All right, guys, I didn't record myself disconnecting all this stuff, but it only took me a matter of minutes. So I disconnected the power steering reservoir from the supply line to the power steering pump, disconnected the mass airflow connector, disconnected our 6-pin connector that we added for the relays for the transmission, which is right there, disconnected all my electrical connectors from the ECU box. I didn't even have to disconnect these 3, but I did anyway. Disconnected my evap hose, disconnected the vacuum hose for the brake booster. We're going to take the air intake off, pull the radiator, and then disconnect 2 grounds underneath. I disconnected the heater hoses here and disconnected the throttle cable. So we just got to disconnect the fuel line, the power steering line, the air intake, and then everything on top's already disconnected. We're ready to pull the motor. We get down underneath. The only stuff that we have to disconnect is the motor mount nuts, which I don't even know if we have those on there. We don't, because they're up here. So we don't even have to take those off. We have to remove the transmission mount and remove the radiator. Core support's already out of it. So we'll just be able to pull the motor pretty quick. We should be able to have this motor out of here in a matter of maybe an hour and a half. So we'll see. Some additional wiring that we have to disconnect. We do have to disconnect the alternator feed, which plugs in right here. And we are going to wind up shortening this cable. We have not shortened this cable yet, so it's pretty freaking excessive. We will wind up shortening it by about 2 foot, maybe 2.5 foot. But that's where it hooks up. We had it tucked in behind here for right now. And then we need to disconnect the starter wire from the main power feed to this box, which is this connection right here. And it goes across the back of the firewall. So we will need to make sure that this is completely separated and free to go with the engine. Intake is being removed right now, so then we can take the radiator hose off, and then we can pull the radiator and fans out, and then we can disconnect the power steering line. And then basically everything on the top of the motor that needs to be disconnected, other than these 2 connections, this one and this one, everything else is disconnected, and we're ready to move on to the bottom of the car. All right, so we have everything disconnected from the top side. We removed the radiator and AC condenser. They weren't even bolted in because we just had them sitting in there. So normally it would not be this easy to remove all this stuff. But we've got the fuel line disconnected, got the evap line disconnected, got the, yeah, there's the other side of the fuel line right there. Got the clutch cable and bleeder line disconnected. Battery cables are disconnected and routed out from behind where they were so that nothing drags while we're pulling it out. Power steering line is disconnected. Like I said earlier, we still have to run the return line for this. So after we get the motor out, we're going to mount the reservoir and we'll route the return line back to the rack. And then really the only thing left to unhook on it to get it to pull is the ground wire that is hooked up right here. You can see two of them running right here. And then Terry's working on removing the transmission mount so that we can pull it out. But once we get that transmission mount removed, we'll hook up the leveler to it and we'll remove the hood and we'll be ready to pull the motor. All right, Terry's taking out the last couple bolts to separate the transmission from the engine. We've already taken both manifolds off. So we're going to separate the transmission, and we're going to reseal where the spacer goes to the transmission, and then we're going to mess with the shifter. All right, so all the bolts are out of the transmission. Now we need to just pull the two clutch lines down. One's a bleeder line, one's the main feed line. And now we should just be able to separate the transmission and it should come right off. So Terry, if you want to pick up on the back of that transmission and pull back, it should just pop right off the engine. You need to kind of pick up and rock it back and forth and get it up and down and pull back. Yep, pull back while you're doing that and it should come off. There you go. Transmission's free. Pick it up and scoot it back. There we go. Awesome. Now we're going to start servicing where we put it together and we didn't seal it. Total freaking oversight. But we need to apply sealant to the back side of this plate where it bolts to the transmission to get it to quit leaking, because it is leaking from just oil sitting in it. And then we do still have to try and figure out what's going on with the shifter, which is what I'm going to focus on right now. I'm going to have Terry tear this apart so that he can start sealing it, and I'm going to work on the shifter. All right, so we managed to get the shifter figured out. What was happening was the bearing in here in the end, we needed to press it in another 1/4 of an inch. Now the thing shifts great. Go ahead and shift through the gears, Terry. You can't go straight into reverse from 5th. You have to clear it. Yeah. All right, but yeah, it goes into all gears smoothly, and it shortened exactly 2 inches. We just had to push the bearing in a little bit further. We were having trouble doing engagement in 2nd, 4th, and reverse, and now that problem is solved. All right, so we just got done resealing the adapter plate to the transmission. All we've got left to do is to torque those bolts. Then we got to mount the bell housing back on it and torque those bolts, and then we'll be ready to put transmission back on the engine. All right, good morning, guys. It is the next day. We worked on the engine a pretty good bit. Got the adapter plate bolted back on, which you just saw. Got the bell housing torqued on. Terry stayed here last night working on welding the exhaust pipes together while I took my son out to dinner. And he's down there grinding it right now, so I don't want to walk down there and video while he's grinding because it's freaking loud. But we're going to finish doing that, run the power steering line, put all that back on the motor, run the reverse light wiring, then we should be able to put the engine back in the car today. And we got the transmission back together. Showed where the shifter is working correctly. So yeah, everything's working good. We're going to put that back on the motor. We'll put the exhaust manifolds back on here. Once we get that bolted back on, I'll run the wiring for it, for the reverse lights, which is right there.
Yeah, it's burned through.
All right, everybody. So Terry has went ahead and got the welding done on both of the header pipes. He's painting them black with some high temp paint. So just using some of this flame proof paint. We've got the transmission bolted back onto the engine, and the shifter and everything is working great on it. We do have to hook up the reverse lights still, which this is the reverse lights right here, that little switch on the side. But the shifter's working great. So shifter's working perfectly now. We still have to extend the wires out a little bit to get them to fall into the ECU box correctly. So we're gonna cut this open a little bit, pull the wires over a little bit, and then tape it back together. We're gonna add a waterproof 2-pin connector right here so that we can hook up the reverse light, so that if we need to service the transmission, we can disconnect it instead of cutting wires. We've already removed this front coolant line off of the front of the water neck. We're gonna put a cap on here and cap that off. And then we're gonna leave this filter on here, and we're gonna hook up the power steering idle up valve to the cold air intake. Normally the nipple that's on the cold air intake would go to this hose, but we're gonna hook it up to here so that we keep the power steering vacuum idle up valve working. And we can just let that vent the atmosphere. But we've also picked up a tube to run for the power steering hose for the return line. It's a little too short. We need a 6-foot line hose, or 6-foot long hose. This one's only 4 foot. But essentially what we're gonna do is we're gonna run that 3/8 hose. So this is our return pipe coming off of the power steering rack. We're gonna run it up here and across here, and then go across the back of the firewall. 4 foot will stop right here if I put it all the way up to the bottom of this plate. If I put it in the center, it'll go from about right here to about right here. Then we'll have to run a rubber hose here up to the power steering reservoir, and we'll have to run a rubber hose from here down to there. But everything's coming along pretty good. Once we get the power steering line run, that should be the last thing we have to run, and then we'll be good to go. All right, guys, so now we're down to the final little bit of stuff we got to make, and the next thing I'm going to do is run the return line for the power steering. This is just some 3/8 PVF steel line, 3/8 diameter, and it's pretty easy to bend, but we're going to run a line from up here in the corner from that hose. We're going to run it around the back, across the back of the firewall, and then down here and down to this fitting which is down there in the corner. So we'll get all that routed. Once that's done, we've got our bracket mounted in here for the ABS controller. Power steering reservoir is mounted. Daytime running lights relay is mounted. So we're making very good progress. We get this line run, and then everything that we needed to do to the car is done. Then we just need to finish mounting the exhaust on the engine after the paint dries. And then we'll be ready to, we'll need to modify the wiring harness and run the reverse lights, and then we'll be ready to drop the motor back in the car. All right, guys, so I'm ran the power steering line. It's not finished, but this is the rough layout of it. We're gonna put a clamp right here to hold it to the side of the frame rail. And then it runs up underneath the brake booster, runs across the back of here. We're gonna put a clamp onto the original bolt right here. Then it runs down through here. We're gonna add a clamp right here to the wheel well, and then it runs up to the reservoir. So that's how we're gonna run our power steering line. And then we'll have a rubber hose going from here up to this line, somewhere on this wall, depending on where we mount it. And then we'll get that clamp on there and get this clamp on there, and then everything will be ready to rock and roll. All right, everybody, so we just got done installing the power steering line, the return line. So we've got a short 3/8 hose running from there up to here. We've got the fuel line tied over to keep it away from the header. And when it gets hooked up to the engine, it'll be hooked up right here. It'll be perfect where I've got it. And then we've got it run up here underneath the brake booster. This is just a piece of paper towel in the line so we don't get trash in it. But you can see the line right there. It runs across the back. We've got a clamp holding it here. Runs across here. Down here, we've got a clamp holding it here. And these are all factory bolt hole locations. We haven't drilled any holes. We're just using basically wire clamps to hold this in place. And then it comes up here, and we've got a rubber line going from here up to the tank. And that is super clean, looks stock. When we get the engine in here, you won't even be able to see it. So now all the mods inside of the car are done, to my knowledge. I could be wrong, but I think we are 100% done with all the mods that have to be done to the vehicle. Now we just need to finish what we got to do to the engine over there. All right, guys, so I am working on the wiring, trying to get this to go out away from the engine a little bit further. And what we've determined is that we have to extend these 3 wires and then this bundle of wires right here. It's a total of 28 wires that we're going to extend. We're going to extend them 2 to 3 inches, depending. These will probably get extended 4 inches. And that'll give us enough play out at the end to where we can put the wiring harness back into the original location for the ECU, and we can route it around the fender and get it looking really clean when we go to get this back together. Right now, we're stretching this to get it to the ECU, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to have anything being pulled on or anything like that. So best remedy for this is to extend these wires and extend this bundle of wires right here. The other wires have plenty, because originally the ECU was on the passenger side on the LS, but on the IS it's on the driver's side. So I had to switch the whole ECU wiring harness over to the other side of the car. So I doubled back on a lot of the wires, but these wires were cut for the harness being on that side, so they're obviously shorter. So I need to just extend these wires. And I mean, like I say, you can see all the excess wire down here from where I doubled back the harness to make it go this way. So not anything major. We know the entire vehicle is working, and we forgot to hook up these 3 ground wires. So I ran these from the ECU, or from the wiring harness. There's actually plugs out here that these are grounds for, but with the intention of grounding them right here, and I totally freaking forgot to. But the engine still runs, so we're gonna go ahead and ground those. We're gonna get the wires extended. After we get the wires extended, we'll have this all buttoned back up, and then we'll be ready to put the engine back into the car. All right, guys, I think that's where I'm going to go ahead and end this video. We still have to finish extending the wires on the harness, and it's probably going to take the better part of a couple afternoons after I get off of work, because Terry wants this thing looking like perfect, which I completely agree with. But it takes more time for perfection. So we're going to slow down, get all the little details taken care of that he wants to take care of before we put the motor back in the car. So it may be a couple days before we put the motor back in. But We want to address any issues that are easy to address while the engine's out of the car before we put it back in. And then we'll address the other issues later. But he wants to make the heat shield for the driver's side exhaust, at least make it, not necessarily bolt it in, but at least make it and fab it to where it'll fit in the car before we put the motor in, which I agree with. But it doesn't need to be in there when we're putting the motor in, because the exhaust could hit it while we're putting it in. So I think once he makes the heat shield and we finish extending the wires, and then he wants to do a bunch of heat shrink and stuff on the harness. So he may spend a week or more doing his little details to the harness that he wants to do, because he's talking about depinning the ignition coils and putting heat shrink on each one of those wires, and depinning the fuel injectors and putting heat shrink on each one of those. So I don't know how long he plans on doing all that stuff, but it's his vehicle. I want it to be what he wants. So if that's what he wants to do, I'm gonna just stand back and be supportive and let him do what he's gonna do, because ultimately it's his vehicle and it needs to be built the way that he wants it. So anyway, we're gonna finish those couple things up, get the motor back in there. Once we get the engine back in there, then we will start looking at doing the drive shaft and doing the exhaust, and then we'll switch out the rear differential for the limited slip differential. And once we get the drive shaft, exhaust, and differential done, and then he puts tires on it, I think it's ready to drive. And then he can put all the rest of his stuff in there that he bought. He bought a bunch of carbon for the interior, a whole bunch of new parts for inside of it, new headlights, new taillights. I mean, he's dropped a lot of money on this car, and it's going to be a very nice car. So I understand the attention to detail that he wants to take, so I'm not going to fight that at all. If my Audi wasn't a daily driver, I would have went through as much detail as he's going through on this car. The Veloster, I probably will wind up going through that much detail, even though it's going to be basically a glorified race car. I still want it to look good and look very presentable, so I'm probably going to spend a shit ton of time detailing every little inch of that car as well. But I'm going to end it here. If you like what you saw in this video, or if it helped you out in any way with trying to do a 1UZ swap, do me a favor and give me a like, follow, comment, share, subscribe, whatever. Let your friends see what I'm doing, and I'll catch you in the next video. Have a great one.